Hi, folks. Welcome to a new talk from me, Phil Medcalf from Alpha Marine Photography. This is a new format I'm trying out, which is recording rather than doing Facebook Live. And hopefully, this will be a series of videos about photography in general. We're probably going to do some underwater photography ones. And if you are an underwater photographer, these will be relevant, but they'll be relevant to any photographer. So hopefully you'll enjoy these. As you probably saw from the little title, today I'm going to take a look at ISO. And this is going to be kind of an introduction to ISO. If you're very, very knowledgeable about ISO, you'll probably find this below your level. But to be honest, ISO is an incredibly complicated subject if you go into it in great detail. So hopefully this will give you some information that you haven't already got about ISO. Starting with, what is ISO? ISO in very simple terms is how light sensitive your camera is. On an adjustable scale. It often gets said that it's how light sensitive your camera's sensor is, and that's not entirely true. And I'll hold my hand up. I have actually used that. I have said that. I have in previous talks said it's how light sensitive your sensor is, and it is in general. A lot of how ISO is measured is to do with the sensor, but apparently there are 5 standards on which ISO is calculated, and some of those are not just to do with the sensor. So it's basically a measurement of how sensitive your camera is to light, and it's digital cameras, it's an adjustable setting. You may, if you were a film photographer, you may remember ISO as being a measurement of film sensitivity. And in those days, you basically bought a film and that film had a particular light sensitivity. So you could buy, say, ISO 200 film, and there you go. That's what you had in the camera until you changed it. Yeah, ISO, one of the sort of trivia things about ISO comes from is a standard set by the International Organization for Standardization. Now you may think, oh well, hang on, that's a bit odd, should it not be called iOS? But that name is only the name in English, and obviously it's an international organization. Different languages call it a different thing. So ISO actually, it was a general name that they came up with. They have apparently said, people have apparently said that ISO is from a Greek term for equal or equity, but I think some people, it's been kind of implied that maybe they decided that after they'd already decided that they were going to call it ISO, and thought, oh, coincidentally. ISO as an organization are the people who set all kinds of standards. So it's just the fact that their scale is what has been used to judge the standard of light sensitivity in film, and then in cameras, in digital cameras, that name has stuck for that scale. And you'll usually see it tends to be in, on cameras, you'll see sort of starting at on different cameras at 100 or 200 and going up. Normally you'll see it in doubles, doubling each time, and those are equate to what we call in exposure stops, because every time you double that number, from 100 to 200, it's twice as sensitive to light, or twice as much light is picked up by the camera. And that goes up and up. You will find that as you get to higher ones on a lot of cameras, there'll be intermediate ones between those doubles. So for example, hang on, let me do some maths. On my camera, where it goes from 3200, there is I think there's 4000, there's 5000, and then 6400. So you'll often get intermediate ones. Now, depending on the camera, certainly on some cameras, what the intermediate ones aren't actually using quite the same thing as the sort of doubles, so the full stops. I don't want to get too into that, as it's, you know, gets things complicated. But yeah, so ISO, the standard ISO for film sensitivity came in, you may remember, a lot of us probably in the UK remember ASA. It was still used a lot as a term even after ISO came in, but in 1974 they put the ASA standard for light sensitivity and the DIN standard, the DIN standard, together, and it became the ISO standard. And it's what it got passed on to digital. The way it was calculated is somewhat different now for digital, but it's what we kind of equate. And yeah, so we use this ISO as a control for how light sensitive the camera is. And if you sort of know your basic sort of photography, you have the thing called the exposure triangle. I probably should have put a slide on for this. As you'll see, if you've watched my Facebook Live talks, this is in a similar vein. It's just, you know, it's just a recorded version of this. But yeah, so if you have your exposure triangle, you have three sides to that: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So it's part of that exposure triangle. If you read some blogs, some pedantic people say, well, it's not part of exposure because it's a different thing. And yeah, okay, that's true, but traditionally it's been part of the exposure triangle. So and what that means is, in terms of how we use ISO tends to be the thing that we adjust when we want to make the camera more light sensitive, so that we can have faster shutter speeds and or smaller apertures. I'm going to do a talk about apertures, I'm going to do a talk about shutter speeds, but there are good reasons to have faster shutter speeds and there are good reasons to have small apertures, depending on what kind of stuff you're doing. You know, if you're doing landscape stuff, small apertures may be the thing. If you're doing wildlife stuff or sports stuff, faster shutter speeds may be what you're after. Both of those things generally are what reduce the amount of light coming in, and that's why you want the camera to be more light sensitive. And there's various terminologies around ISO, starting with this sort of basic thing of what's called base ISO, and that's the ISO that the camera produces the optimum quality image at, and generally it tends to be ISO 100 or ISO 200. On my camera, wait for camera out, yeah, the Olympus OMD, this is the M10 Mark II. The base ISO is 200, and when you start increasing the ISO, what the camera is doing is changing it is, I think generally it's to do with sort of pushing more power through the sensor to make it more sensitive. Again, I am not a physicist. I do not make cameras for a living. I am just, it's just a basic sort of thing, this. But yeah, so what on my actual camera, when you change ISO, if it's set to 200, it actually says recommended on the screen next to 200. Now, interestingly, my camera doesn't have anything sort of standard below that, apart from it says low. And this is another thing in terminology in ISO, is you'll hear what's called native ISO, and another term extended or sometimes expanded depending on the company, but the common sort of term you'll hear is native ISO. And what does that mean? That basically means that is the ISO settings of the camera that don't involve software changes to the image that the camera takes. So it's using the electronics, the hardware of the camera, to increase the light sensitivity. It's not doing any jiggery pokery, and I'll explain non-native ISO, but let's have a quick picture. So as I said, in the sort of base ISO of my camera, the 200 is what generally will give you the best picture, and that's a great deal to do with noise, and I'll show you noise in a second. But here's a quick picture, and this is taken by me of basically I'm doing what I'm doing, taking the picture. And this was taken at ISO 200. I do the majority of my underwater photography, I use base ISO of 200. I don't tend to adjust the ISO very much, and that's because in general I use flash for a great deal of what I do underwater, because I want to add light. I want to be able to sort of see the colors even at depth, and I like my subjects that way, so I've got plenty of light going on. It's less of a concern. Now, if I want the background, more of the background to show up, I tend to reduce my shutter speed. There is a point where if if conditions are dark, you're at depth or whatever, and you want more light in your background, or on land and you're using flash and you want more light on your background, what you may find is that you end up increasing your ISO. What you may also find is you then have to reduce the output of your flashes, whatever, on land or underwater. You may find you have to do that to counteract the increased sensitivity caused by the raised ISO. It's a juggling act. Photography is always a juggling act. I apologies for people who normally shoot on auto and things. Your camera will do these kind of juggling acts of its own accord, but what it tends to do is be less creative, because it's doing the controlling. So you may find that your camera, if you set it to auto or the ISO is on auto, when it gets dark, it will start to slow shutter speeds down, increase aperture, and maybe increase ISO. Now, the problem arises when you start increasing ISO is that there is this thing called noise. And noise is often people talk about grain. In film photography, we used to get grain, and different films, higher ISOs, images would look more grainy. Noise is a bit different. In the noise tends to be a bit more random. It is random. Certainly, the noise you get from high ISOs is actually quite often referred to as random noise. Hopefully you'll be able to see this in this picture. This is a close-up of a picture taken at very high ISO, and conditions were dark, and then the light the image has been adjusted because it was still too dark, even though this was taken at 16,000 ISO. It was still dark, so it was brightened up, and this is part of the main an image. I'll show you the main image in a moment, but you probably can see in here, I could have made it even worse, to be honest, by adjusting the picture a bit more in Photoshop to show it off. But hopefully you can see that this doesn't, you've got sort of random colors and things like that in there, and this is noise. This is what noise is. I'll show you the original image. Let me bring you up there. So this is the actual image, and this was taken, this is at 16,000 ISO. Basically there was some light being provided, but it was pretty dark. This is a leopard in South Africa, and it's not a picture, it's a picture to sort of say, yeah, we saw a leopard pretty much at night. The thing with this picture was, where we were taking the pictures, the place where we were staying, they were doing studies into leopards, and this picture was certainly good enough for them to be able to ID the individual leopard from its markings. So even, high ISOs are useful, even if they don't necessarily produce images that are good enough for magazines or competition or sticking on your wall or whatever. So yeah, very high ISOs, as you go higher in ISO, you start to get noise in your images, and there's reasons why noise can be worse. You tend to find things that sort of reduce the amount of noise tends to be how large your camera's sensor is compared to how many megapixels it is, because the larger the individual pixels on the sensor, the less noise you tend to get, and that stems from it's to do with the signal versus the noise produced in electronic systems. So a larger sensor will get more signal going through it because there's more light hitting that individual, sorry, I said sensor, I meant pixel. A large pixel will have more light going through the individual pixel. Now what you'll find is that, and this is what happens, is you get a small sensor camera with, say, 12 megapixels versus a large sensor camera with 12 megapixels. You're going to get less noise, and it's interesting that some manufacturers on fairly large sensor cameras have opted to produce sort of specific ones for film and sort of low light with less megapixels. Panasonic's GH5S, I think it is, which was their sort of video one. I think that has 9 megapixels, whereas the original one I think was 20. Don't quote me on that. But yeah, so some manufacturers have actually opted to reduce the megapixels to make the camera a better performer at low light, and that means you can push up ISOs and get less noise. And you'll see that, you'll also see it's not just about size of pixels though. You'll also find a lot of it now is about the actual tech in the camera and the camera's sensor. Cameras generally have in-camera noise correction, which will be applied if you're taking JPEG pictures. It will be applied to your picture. But you can shoot raw and correct it with software afterwards, so you don't necessarily need to have that noise correction turned on. What you'll also find is when you're doing very long exposures, the noise reduction that's involved tends to take as long as the exposure does. And you'll find this, you do like a 30-second exposure, you have to wait a minute for it to finish taking the picture because it does noise reduction. But yeah, noise reduction for long shutter speeds is slightly different. Sorry, I'm confusing the issue. So yeah, we're talking about noise. So hopefully you could see that in the image. Please, after you watch this or when you're watching this, please comment in the comment section on the page, and let me know what you think about this, and feel free to ask questions. So the cameras, camera tech has improved, and you see this. My camera, the top ISO I think is something like 25,600, but that's not what we call native ISO. Sorry, I think I ramble a bit, somewhat along the lines of a Billy Connolly joke. I tend to go off at a tangent and eventually find my way back. Native ISO, when we use this term native, is the ISO that the light sensitivity that the camera's hardware can produce. On this camera, that goes up to 5,000. Now, the newer versions, the native ISO goes up to 6,400. What happens when you go beyond that is that the camera's software starts to kind of interpolate and work out, change the actual image using software. And you basically get a sort of software produced substitute for what the hardware is producing up till then. How it does that is kind of, it basically, the image is originally is going to be underexposed as it comes out of the sensor, and then the software adjusts the exposure. So on a high ISO, extended ISO, that's what it does. It does an underexposure. On my camera, it has this low extended as well, and what it does there is it's basically overexposing the image and then adjusting the exposure, reducing the exposure. Now, what that means in real terms is when you get your image out, you'll have less dynamic range to play with. There'll be less that you can adjust. Now, some cameras basically don't do this, and that's what you get as a JPEG. Other cameras, if you set the ISO, if you go into extended ISO, it still applies that to the raw file. And mine, I have noticed, still does that to the raw file. Now, whether there's a trick to get that back, I don't know. Please sort of let me know. But what it's basically doing is it's reducing the amount of dynamic range you can then play around with. So what I would say to you is I'd avoid using, certainly if you're shooting raw, I'd avoid going into extended ISO. I'd stop when you're at the top of native. This picture, sorry, I'll go back to this. This picture was taken at extended, and it's certainly, I think better results would have been got, or at least similar results could be achieved by not going out of the native and just adjusting it with software, Adobe Lightroom or Photoshop or something similar. Let me show you a few more pictures. So just to give you an idea of what kind of stuff I'm doing, and why I'm adjusting ISO. This picture, this is a squirrel. You probably realise that, unless you've never, I don't know, is there anyone out there who's never seen a squirrel? Kind of stating the obvious there. This is a red squirrel, and this was up in Scotland, and we were getting into evening, and these squirrels appeared. Literally, we'd arrived back at the car park, and this was at the car park, and this very cooperative red squirrel appeared. But obviously, the light was quite low. The rain was coming down. You can actually see like lines in places where it's actually raining, and so it was difficult circumstances. I was taking pictures with a long lens on the camera, and I needed a fairly fast shutter speed. So I increased the ISO. So this was taken at 1250 ISO on the camera, and what that did was give me enough light sensitivity that I could keep my shutter speeds fairly fast. So I think this was taken at 1/250th. I used a big aperture because I didn't want to go get a very noisy picture. So this was taken, luckily, squirrels are quite cooperative, or at least this one was, and turned side on. So depth of field wasn't a big issue. So this was a f5.6, I think, so as wide as the camera lens would go, camera aperture would go. Yeah, so as an example, 1250 at one stage, on early, small sensor compact cameras, 1250 would probably be very noisy indeed. But on this sort of camera, this is taken with a micro four thirds sensor, so a reasonable size sensor, not not full frame, but bigger than a camera phone sensor by a good long way. So yeah, now what I found, and I'll show you some more pictures. What you've got to do with ISO is to avoid getting noise. The primary thing is get the exposure right in the camera. The better your exposure is, the less you have to adjust it with software, the less noise is going to show in your pictures. You can do, I do a bit of noise reduction, but I try, you don't want to do a lot, certainly not of the whole picture. You don't want to do a lot of noise reduction because it tends to start to smooth the detail out, and then your picture starts to look a bit odd, like it's been sort of painted or something, or the whole thing's been airbrushed. So I try to get, when I'm using high ISOs, I try and get the exposure as good as possible. I don't sort of do the shooting to the left or shooting to the right. Get the exposure as bob on as you can would be my advice. Let's go up a bit more in ISO. So this is at 2000, and this is another classic example of needing to shoot high ISOs. I was shooting over a distance. I was in a Land Rover which wasn't moving, but we had the vibration of Land Rover, so I was having to hold the camera handheld at fully zoomed. So this was with a Panasonic 100 to 300 millimeter lens, which equates on a full frame camera would be a 600 millimeter. And you certainly, it kind of, the rule of thumb generally is you want a shutter speed at least as to be as fast as the focal length is. So if you've got a 300 millimeter lens, we used to always sort of say, go for above 300, 1/300, so 1/320th. Now, with image stabilization on cameras now being much better, that's not entirely a necessity, but when you've got things that are maybe moving, you want fast shutter speeds anyway. So this was a picture I wanted a fast shutter speed, and this was early morning. I talked about wildlife photography on a Facebook Live talk. I'll probably put that on YouTube at some stage. But when you're doing safaris, you tend to go out early in the morning, and in the afternoon, around going towards sunset. But yeah, you can be out before sunrise in the mornings, and yeah, the light levels aren't high. So this lion nicely posed. In fact, one of the big advantages with this picture is there's a lot of mixed sort of detail in the background. Noise tends to show up more on constant sort of colors, flat backgrounds that don't have a lot of detail in. You can kind of jump, you get less noise, or you see less noise in more detailed, more jumbled, mixed backgrounds. So because this guy was against brush and stuff, it's much more mixed up, so the noise, if there was any, didn't show up as much. But with, as I say, with modern cameras and a bit of sort of software based noise reduction after the event, and getting the exposure right in camera, you can go higher and higher in ISO. So this was a picture I took the other day, early morning. The light just was pretty nice actually, and it kind of showed up. There was some nice sort of colours in the trees and things. This was at 2500 ISO, and I didn't go very heavy-handed with noise reduction. It didn't need vast amounts. I tend to do noise reduction in two steps. I do noise reduction with the sort of luminance and smoothing tool in Lightroom very delicately, because it affects the whole image. So I only do a bit to sort of get rid of the sort of worst noise, and I tend to not go heavy on it. And then I tend to apply some noise reduction using smart sharpening in Adobe Photoshop, which I tend to more use that for the sharpening effect when I want sharpening. But can go even higher than that. This picture, this swan, I don't think might have been the same day, not sure. This I haven't cropped at all. The previous one I actually cropped, so the noise would have showed up even more, but this I haven't cropped, so it's probably but this is at 5000 ISO. That's the maximum native ISO that my camera will go up to. And there's a fair bit of detail, so you can see that I've not gone heavy on the noise reduction, and it still doesn't, it doesn't look bad to me. You could have your own opinions. Photography, photography is an art. It's not, it's not a set thing. So you can go, oh, don't rate that at all, mate. But as a demonstration of what you can achieve, I think I'll go back to it. I think it's not, it at least shows you can get a pretty clear, usable picture at 5000 ISO, and I think that's to do with reasonable size sensors, with not overly heavy on the pixels, but also good sort of quality tech in the camera, which is one reason I often see people, certainly in underwater photography, asking about, like, I wanted they want to take their DSLR underwater, or they've been offered a DSLR, and when you sort of ask them what DSLR is, and it's something from the dawn of digital photography, something from, like, not quite, but doing like 2006 or something, or 2008, a 14-year-old 12-year-old camera, and they're like, oh yeah, and someone will say, oh, it's a good camera. It's like, yeah, but what's inside a compact? It may be a digital SLR, it may have a large, like an APS-C or a full frame sensor, but the tech has come on so far that you'll probably find at high ISOs, there'll be 1-inch sensor compacts will outperform like an early full frame or APS-C camera in low light. So think on that when you're looking at what sort of camera you're going to be using and stuff. Certainly, I'd rather have one of these. This is even fairly old, but certainly because of how the tech's come on, an APS-C camera from a couple of years before this, which has a bigger sensor, will probably not perform as well as this. And certainly we've just acquired, thanks to the fact that we got burgled, we've just acquired a Mark IV EM10 that was sent as a replacement for one that got stolen, and that again, the performance on that is better yet because it's a couple of generations along. Its native ISO is now 6400 maximum, so you get a bit more out of it. I've not played around with it quite so much. How that balances out, it's got more pixels on the same size sensor as well. So whether that will balance out, or whether certainly other things in its performance are definitely better. But there you go. Let me just have a look. I have a little crib sheet on the top here, so I've talked about most of these things. There are sort of, if you are looking to edit images, as I say, I do use Adobe Lightroom and Photoshop. There are sort of specific or add-on software that is particularly good at noise reduction. In particular, Topaz is the one that people are generally sort of saying for noise reduction. I haven't used it. As I say, I don't feel like I really am missing out as long as I'm not botching the picture to start off with. And I'll hold my hand up. I botched plenty of pictures in my time. But yeah, when as I say, from the picture of the swan, you can push the ISOs up, and if you get the exposure right and the conditions right, I don't feel I need more software than I've already got to deal with the noise. I think that's where I'm gonna sort of say okay. I've probably, there are more detailed things. There is a lot of sort of things going on with tech. You'll see a lot of sensors have what's called dual native ISO, which uses more technology in the actual sensor construction to let you have higher ISOs and more light sensitivity with less noise and things. And there's various manufacturers have come up with various versions. I think dual is Nikon's thing, dual native. Correct me if I'm wrong. But there you go. I mean, we are seeing cameras with very high ISO capability these days, and you can make use of it. Don't necessarily shy away from it. People often sort of say high ISOs, lots of noise, but it's there's more to it than that. You can sort of deal with it, and a lot of it is get the exposure right. I'll probably my next talk may well be about another element of exposure. Certainly we will be doing more of these, and thank you for tuning in. If you want to comment, please comment below in the comments section. And also, if you'd like to support what I do, we have a buy me a coffee page if you want to buy me a coffee to help support me in doing these talks. Please do. If you want any advice about underwater photography, if you're interested in the workshops we do or the equipment we sell, please get in touch. This is our website. There's blogs on there. There's more information about what we do, and you can email me at info@alphamarinePhoto.com for anything, advice, equipment sales, underwater photography workshops. We do editing workshops. We also are happy to do photography one-to-ones. We can do photography walks if you want to do a bit of nature photography and things. We're based in Manchester. You can come and meet up when lockdown eventually ends and things. So thank you very much for watching, and hopefully I'll be back soon.